I'll never forget the morning 6 excavators idled at the end of my gravel drive like patient predators, their metal jaws bright and careless under a white sky that promised heat and trouble. My name is David Carter, and I came back to Oakwood Heights to restore the land my grandfather worked when owning land as a black man meant carrying receipts in your pocket and dignity in your jaw. The barn stood there red as a heartbeat and older than the HOA itself. And in its shadow, wheat heads bobbed in a wind that moved different across memory than it did across vinyl siding. Karen Peton, the HOA president, stood at the front with a clipboard and a camera crew smile, the kind you use when you're sure the narrative belongs to you. She wore the look of somebody who never doubts a policy if it benefits her sense of order and never doubts herself even when she's wrong. Her eyes slid across my property the way I've seen custom appraisals glide past black-owned improvements and still come up short. "This barn," she said flatly, "violates Section 12.4 of the Aesthetic Guidelines." I told her it predated the HOA by 60 years. She told me grandfather clauses don't apply to agricultural structures in a residential zone. It was the kind of sentence that pretends to be neutral while standing exactly where it intends to stand. 3 weeks earlier, I'd rebuilt the old rafters, replaced the rot with sturdy pine treated for the next generation, added a climate-controlled room because some seeds can live a long time if you give them a chance and a little cold. I planted the first test plots of Morrison red winter wheat, the strain my grandfather guarded in mason jars during drought years and shared in envelopes with other black farmers when those farmers couldn't get credit but still needed hope. I logged soil moisture numbers and watched the light angle off the heads, and for the first time since coming home, I felt the land accept me. Then came the first letter, a violation notice for visible equipment near the entrance. My grandfather's restored seed drill had become commercial signage. I moved it inside. Then another letter. My barn's color clashed with the earth tone palette approved by the HOA. Red is the color of barns where I come from and also the color of history when you trace it honestly. I offered to stain the north wall darker to soften the street view. They rejected that as insufficient and sent a photo of a taupe garage as the ideal. Then another letter. The wheat attracted pests. What kind? I asked at the meeting. Silence, then the familiar pivot to tone. "Sir, your attitude is becoming adversarial," Karen said, the word "sir" flat like a lid closing on a jar. She banged her gavel in a room where no one else needed a gavel. I had spoken for 40 seconds. Later that week, a neighbor I barely knew left a note on my door, written in that careful font suburban printers use for block parties and warnings both. It said, "Kindly be aware that field-like plantings lower property. Values and introduce allergens uncomfortable. For families with children." I thought about the 2-acre lawn across the street sprayed with something that kept it the exact same color, through a drought, and wondered which plants they meant by allergens. At the Saturday board gathering in the clubhouse they called Coffee and Conversation, I tried again. I brought printouts and a binder and copies of registration records because paperwork is a language racists have always respected more than people. I explained that my wheat is registered with the National Plant Germplasm System as a heritage variety, and that the barn was recognized as a satellite seed preservation site. I explained the Plant Variety Protection Act and the USDA's remit for safeguarding research materials and how destruction of those materials could constitute interference with a federal program. Karen didn't hear any of it because she wasn't listening. She was waiting. "Mr. Carter, your personal projects are not our concern, and we can't run a neighborhood on exceptions." Personal projects. I thought of my grandfather's hands, scarred from wood beams and the sun-grade rope he saved because you never know when rope could make a job survivable. I thought of the file he kept with mortgage notes and threats tucked side by side because in this country you file both. I went home to another notice already in the mailbox, certified this time, demolition of non-compliant structure within 30 days, or removal will occur and costs will be assessed to the property. Estimated $40,000, signed by Karen, neat and tall as if handwriting could make it righteous. That night I lay under the rafters in a folding cot because sometimes I sleep in the barn when the grain smell turns sweet and the ghosts want company. I stared at the beams my grandfather lifted with cousins who are now lines on an old program from a funeral 6 summers ago. I remembered him saying, "Boy, don't ever let them count you out on your own land," and I knew what I had to do. I wrote emails and attached photos and scanned documents I keep duplicated in 3 places because I know how stories get erased when you're black and white. I wrote to my contact at the Agricultural Research Service, to a lawyer I trust who speaks the dialect of statute like it's his first language, and to a program coordinator at the Federal Seed Preservation Program who knows the difference between a hobby and a heritage. In the morning, I called the county to log a record of attempted demolition, and I requested copies of HOA meeting minutes by certified letter. I CC'd my attorney and added receipts to a folder labeled Barn Matter because clarity is its own quiet weapon. The days between the letters and the rumble of those excavators felt like living under a slow storm. Neighbors who'd waved before now looked past me at their phones like I was a notification they could swipe away. A jogger paused every morning to photograph my lot and send it somewhere because he always turned his wrist the way people do when there's an audience you can't see. Someone created a thread on the neighborhood app about standards and safety and how exceptions weaken a community and posted a photo of my barn, with the address discreetly blurred the way. You blur a face while making sure the person is still identifiable. One night, a patrol car idled, long enough that the wheat hissed like it was whispering, and the officer climbed out and asked polite questions, the kind that make you feel your 2 words. Away from wearing handcuffs if you raise your voice. He said they'd received a call about commercial activity at a residence after hours. I showed him the seed freezer and the logbook, and the USDA sticker on the metal door, and kept my tone even because I have practiced keeping my tone even longer than I've practiced any science. He nodded and drove off, and the next morning the HOA sent another letter citing unusual nocturnal traffic and attached a blurry photo of the patrol car as if the proof of their surveillance was my crime. The fines escalated in tidy increments. 200, then 500, then 1,000, framed as administrative costs, because the more polite a system looks, the less you can see the bruise. At the next HOA meeting, I arrived early and set my binder on the table and waited. People filed in wearing that mix of gym leisure and weekend denim that says, "We are comfortable and in charge of the space between." Karen tapped her gavel and began public comments by asking everyone to keep remarks brief and respectful because we're all neighbors and neighbors follow rules together. I said my name for the record and began the same explanation again. But Karen interrupted to remind me of my time limit, and then reminded me again, and then told me my voice was becoming heated while I was still on sentence 3. A man on the back row who'd never spoken to me raised his hand to ask whether my wheat was safe for kids and pets because it looks wild and you never know. Another asked whether I had considered painting the barn taupe to reduce visual impact. Someone else said barns belong on farms, not next to cul-de-sacs, and I wondered whether my house had ever looked like a cul-de-sac to people who decided the shape of communities and the color of safety. I left when the vote to authorize demolition passed unanimously. On the way out, a woman touched my elbow and said in a whisper, "I hope you don't think this is personal," and the kindness in her voice sounded like the kind that never costs the speaker anything. I told her I didn't think it was personal. I knew it was structural. The next days I worked quietly and documented everything. I calibrated the hygrometer in the seed room and checked the generator because you don't survive long on heritage if you don't respect power outages. I packaged 4 envelopes of kernel samples labeled MRW42 and placed them in a lockbox with shipping forms because redundancy is a promise to family. I walked the wheat rows and counted tillers and flagged 3 spots where soil compaction needed loosening, and I thought about the roads my grandfather said were hardest, not because of distance, but because of who controlled the gates. On the morning they came to tear it all down, the air tasted like metal and threat. Trucks rolled slow like they already owned the land. Karen's heels clicked across gravel built by my grandfather's hands, and my father's overtime and my own choice to come back when leaving would have been simpler. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said in that voice that can boil water without raising its pitch. "We're proceeding as scheduled." I told her she was proceeding toward a federal problem and handed her a copy of the cease and desist request I'd filed with a cover letter that included the statutory citations in bold. She smiled a lawyer's smile that says I've already calculated your options and they don't include dignity. Our counsel has reviewed your claims, she said, and finds them inapplicable to this jurisdiction. She said jurisdiction like a gate closing. Behind her, the foreman made the circle gesture with his hand and the machines coughed themselves awake. Neighbors gathered in knots at the corners of lawns, holding coffee like talismans and phones like shields. The jogger had stopped running again. A teenager on a scooter filmed from the curb with a look that belonged to someone who would learn. Later, that context is everything and almost no one saves it. I took a step toward the barn, and a security guard Karen had hired took a step toward me. He didn't touch his belt, but I saw the memory of people who have, and I paused because this land has seen enough dumb courage. Karen said, "This will be easier for all of us if you don't escalate." And her use of the word escalate made me picture a courtroom and a news clip and my mother's hands finding mine with relief afterward. Or not. I kept my voice even. You received 3 letters from me with documentation of federal designation. She blinked at that speed people blink when they skip a sentence they don't like. We receive many letters, she said. Then I'll summarize mine. You're attempting to destroy a preservation site and the research materials inside are registered and monitored under federal authority. The foreman called out, "Ready on 1, ready on 2, and the bucket arm lifted a fraction of an inch like a finger about to poke the eye of history. I looked past Karen to the wheat. Wind rolled the heads in a low wave, and it looked like the land was breathing slow to show me how. I said out loud to my grandfather, "I've got it." Karen gave a tiny shake of her head, almost pitying. "Mr. Carter, this is a neighborhood, not a museum." I thought of all the museums built only after communities were dismantled and wondered if she knew the economy of that order. The first excavator lurched forward 3 feet, and the metal teeth flashed. I lifted my phone to record, and my hand was steady because this was not the first time I'd had to prove I was telling the truth while the truth was happening. Somewhere behind me, a car turned into the drive fast enough to spit gravel. The foreman half-turned and Karen didn't. She'd already decided the story. I had already decided it too, but differently. The car slid to a stop, black paint dusted white, and the door cracked open, and the shape of a badge caught the day like a mirror. Karen's smile fluttered, then returned. She raised her clipboard, and I saw her write something short, like a timestamp for her win. The person in the suit stepped out, and the engine noise seemed to pull back just enough to make space for a voice. "Mr. Carter," the woman called. "I'm Special Agent Rachel Torres with the USDA Office of Inspector General. Please step back to a safe distance while we address a federal matter." Karen froze for 2 seconds, the shortest eternity I've ever seen. Then she turned slowly, like a door on a hinge that's been leaned against too long. Agent Torres walked straight toward the excavators and lifted a hand the way someone does when they speak a language machines understand. Everything stilled to a waiting kind of silence, the kind that arrives right before truth lands with paperwork and authority and history behind it. Agent Torres stepped between me and the line of machines, like a blade parting 2 worlds, the demolition crew still holding their controls mid-breath. Karen's clipboard trembling just enough to make the papers flutter like frightened wings. Torres's voice was calm but heavy, the kind that fills a space with order. She said, "All demolition. Activity is suspended effective immediately. This property is under federal review per the Plant Variety Protection Act Section 29 and the Federal Seed Preservation Initiative subsection C3. Any damage to the contents of this structure will constitute destruction of protected research material punishable under federal statute." The foreman blinked, his jaw tightening. He looked at Karen for instruction. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. It was a strange kind of justice, too. "Watch a woman so fluent in control discover what silence tastes like." Torres turned to me and nodded. "I'd like to inspect the facility, sir." She said. I led her to the barn door. The crowd behind us, whispering in confusion. Someone muttered, I thought, "This was just a farm." Another said, "Why's the feds here?" Torres examined the climate units, the seed freezers, the labeling system. She asked questions with the precision of someone trained to separate claim from fact. When she finished, she turned back toward the gathering line of neighbors and lifted her badge so it caught the sun. "This barn," she said, "is federally registered as a heritage agricultural site. Its contents are property of the United States Department of Agriculture. Attempts to demolish it would have been felony interference." Every head in that crowd shifted toward Karen as if pulled by the same magnet. Karen's smile fractured her knuckles white on the clipboard. She stammered something about jurisdiction again, and Torres handed her an envelope that ended the conversation. "Here is your cease and desist order. She said you will not issue further fines or notices pending investigation." Karen's lips parted to object, but Torres added, "and any additional contact with Mr. Carter outside official communication will be documented as harassment under federal review that shut her down better than any gavel ever could." The demolition crew began packing up the foreman, muttering, "Sorry, sir," as he directed the machines. Away, one of them gave me a small nod, the kind working people give when they recognize another kind of work. The neighbors stayed because curiosity is stronger than conscience. They whispered about pests and programs and how they never knew wheat could bring agents in suits. Torres asked to see my documentation. I showed her everything. She scanned the pages fast and precise. She said, "You did the right thing." "Mr. Carter, too many people assume heritage is a hobby when it's actually a responsibility." The words landed somewhere deep where my grandfather's stories live. Karen tried to save face, walking up to Torres saying, "We didn't know he was affiliated with any government project. This was all a misunderstanding." Torres's expression didn't change. "Ignorance is not a defense in administrative law," she said. "And besides, you were informed 3 times in writing." She produced my letters, each signed, for by members of the board. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a porch light flickering before going out. Torres thanked me for my cooperation and said they'd follow up formally. The SUVs pulled away their tires, whispering against the gravel. The crowd broke apart in quiet amazement. I stood in the doorway of the barn watching them leave, my wheat glinting gold behind me. I thought maybe this is what vindication sounds like: soft wind and the absence of engines that wanted to destroy. That evening, the HOA chat lit up screenshots, rumors, apologies. The next morning, local news vans parked at the end of the block. A reporter with careful hair spoke into a microphone saying a suburban demolition halted by federal agents after resident claims protection under heritage agriculture laws. I didn't watch. I had work to do. I spent the day tightening bolts on the seed room door because you fix what you can reach. Even when the bigger structures still leaned that night, I was served an invitation to an emergency HOA meeting attendance. Required the kind of phrase that forgets authority, only works if someone shows up. I went anyway. The clubhouse buzzed like an exposed wire when I entered. People turned in clusters, some with guilt, some with relief. Karen sat at the head of the table, her posture brittle beside her. The HOA lawyer, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He cleared his throat and began reading from a folder. The association, he said, faces potential federal liability under multiple statutes, including interference with a preservation site, misuse of member funds, and harassment. The penalties could exceed $250,000, depending on findings. Murmurs rippled. Through the room, Karen tried to regain control, saying this board acted in good faith to preserve community standards and we have nothing to hide. A homeowner interrupted. "If that's true, why are the news trucks outside?" Another asked. "Did you really sign for those letters?" Karen glared at me, then said, "This resident has turned a private matter into a spectacle." I said quietly, "No, Karen, you did when you brought bulldozers to my door." The lawyer continued his report. "The insurance company is reviewing whether your actions voided coverage." Karen's composure cracked, her voice tightened. I've dedicated years to this community only to be vilified by a man who refuses to follow rules. Someone in the back said rules or racism, and the room went. Still, the lawyer finished by recommending suspension of all board activity. Pending investigation, a vote followed 72% in favor of immediate removal. The same gavel Karen had used to silence me was taken from her hand mid-sentence. She rose, shaking, tried to appeal, but the motion had carried the security guard she'd hired escorted her out. Her heels struck the tile too loud for the size of the room. She passed me at the door and hissed, "You think this makes you safe?" I looked at her and said, safer than before Agent Torres entered. Then she had stayed to observe the proceedings. She handed Karen another envelope. This one thinner but heavier. It contained a $50,000 fine for knowingly attempting to interfere with a federal program. After written notice, Karen's lawyer reached for it like he could catch the consequences before they landed, but Torres wasn't finished. She announced that the investigation had uncovered evidence of financial misconduct, misuse of HOA funds, and a side agreement with the demolition contractor, granting exclusive rights in exchange for kickbacks. These findings, she said, are being referred to the Department of Justice and the FBI. The silence that followed was total. Karen's face drained of color. She looked smaller suddenly, as though her authority had been a costume too heavy to keep wearing. Someone gasped when Torres mentioned potential charges of mail fraud and conspiracy, federal offenses carrying up. To 5 years in prison, Karen sat down hard. The chair squealed. The crowd of homeowners stared not at me now, but at the wreckage of their own governance. The meeting adjourned under a fog of shock. I stepped outside into the cool night. The news. Crews had moved closer, lights bright against the dark. One reporter asked, "How does it feel?" "Mr. Carter, to stand up to your HOA." I said I didn't stand up to them. I stood up for my grandfather's land. There's a difference. The next morning headlines. Read, HOA President faces federal charges after attempt to bulldoze protected heritage farm. Neighbors dropped off small gestures, pies bread. An apology written on a grocery receipt. Tom Harrison from 3 houses down introduced himself properly. Said he was a chef at a restaurant downtown and asked if I'd be willing to sell him some of the heritage grain for his menu. I told him maybe once the next harvest came when I walked through the wheat. Later the air felt lighter. Every stalker. Survivor of something bigger than itself. I thought of my grandfather and how he used to say history doesn't disappear. It just waits for you to prove you remember it. The barn stood tall against the blue, like it had always known this day would. Come its beams humming with the stored breath of generations. As I locked up that evening, I whispered, "You're safe now." The wind carried the sound across the field. Soft but sure moral. Sometimes the loudest prejudice hides behind paperwork and bylaws, but truth and law can still find their way through the cracks of a fence. If someone keeps the record straight. I turned toward the fading sun, its light spilling over the wheat, and thought maybe this time the land was finally breathing easy. Again, if you like this story, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more HOA tales and real-life neighborhood drama each week.